Welcome back to another episode of Decoding Project 2025, a special project of the Taking Down Trump podcast. I'm your host, Tristan Snell. For a number of weeks now, we have been going more and more into the various rings of hell that are the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 on behalf of and for the betterment of, or in the worsening of America, the betterment of Donald Trump, This is all run by, authored by all of Trump's senior officials. We're talking folks that were either cabinet officials or number two at different agencies. Senior advisors from throughout the first Trump administration have come together under the auspices of the far-right Heritage Foundation to author Project 2025, which Donald Trump, of course, keeps on trying to disown and say that he had nothing to do with. But that doesn't really work. It works about the same as his efforts to disown Eric or Don Jr. or Tiffany. He's done a pretty good job of trying to disown Tiffany. But he actually has a harder time disowning Project 2025. This was very much a project that he undertook. I'm starting with this for a really big reason, because as these attacks that we have mounted on Project 2025 to show how it is in fact the most extreme set of policy proposals from a major political party in America since the Civil War. That's what this is. It's been 160 years since we've seen such extreme proposals. Why do I say the Civil War? Because back then you had folks actually saying that they were in favor of slavery. So I think that that's a safe thing that we can say, okay, this is less extreme than that, thank God, but not by a ton. Okay, this is the most extreme set of policy proposals that we've seen from one of our major political parties. And Donald Trump was not only the beneficiary of this, it wasn't just his people. We're talking folks like Ben Carson, okay, who was the secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And he's the author of the section on the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The number two at the Department of Homeland Security under Trump, Ken Cuccinelli, was the author of the section on the Department of Homeland Security. To say that this has nothing to do with Donald Trump is just a complete fallacy and would be humorous if it wasn't so deadly serious. So we're turning this week to one of the very worst sections of this entire document. It's the section on the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. So this is really critical, gets into core issues around healthcare and around reproductive rights and some of the most nefarious things that they're talking about in Project 2025. Some of the ones that a lot of you probably already know about are here. It starts right off the bat on page 451 with this humdinger of a quote. Families comprised of a married mother, father, and their children are the foundation of a well-ordered nation and healthy society. Sorry, that's sort of the vibe I get from it. It's very Nuremberg, gives off some nice fascist vibes. But when you start talking about a well-ordered nation and healthy society, it seems a little fascist, maybe a little eugenicist, maybe a little bit in there. Yeah, there's a reason. That's not a mistake. That's not a typo. They're going for a vibe here. This really gets a lot worse very quickly. So they move on to blasting public-private partnerships. So I want to get a little policy wonk about this here. What are those? Those are when you have dedicated programs involving the government with companies in the private sector to carry out shared objectives. Okay, this is something that is not necessarily lefty, let's just say. Public-private partnerships have been something that the right, that conservatives have been pushing for decades and decades, including a lot of Heritage Foundation white papers, okay? The reason that we've got a lot of public-private partnerships throughout the federal government, state government, local government is in part because of conservatives. It's the driving reason why, right? Even some things you don't think of as public-private partnerships kind of are, like the Affordable Care Act is this weird combination of government programs next to working in tandem with private insurance. Why? Because it was actually the Heritage Foundation that came up with the framework for the ACA back in the 90s. And it was first tried for real by Mitt Romney when he was governor of Massachusetts. It was a success in Massachusetts, and it became the basis for Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, the ACA. I only say this to show just how far things like the Heritage Foundation keep drifting further and further to the extreme right, okay? The extreme right. Things that they used to espouse, like public-private partnerships or the framework for what has become the Affordable Care Act, now become things that they want to tear down, get rid of, eliminate, kill, because they have gone further and further and further to the extreme ultra right. So public-private partnerships involving NIH, CDC, the FDA, they're suddenly under fire from the Heritage Foundation when these kind of partnerships between, say, private pharma companies and the federal government were the kinds of things that the Heritage Foundation and other allied organizations pushed for a very, very long time. It's the reason why they exist. Then they start talking about all these conflicts of interest with drug companies. And there's a part here around page 460 where they actually start sounding like super left liberals. They actually, like, you wonder if this was like, oh, is this a Bernie Sanders policy paper? They actually want to get rid of or regulate pharma advertising, which is something that, guess who actually made pharma advertising? A little bit of a history lesson here. For decades and decades and decades, pharma companies could not advertise drugs. Okay. For those who are old enough to remember, if you go back to like the 1970s, 80s, into the 90s, you didn't have those. Those ads weren't there. All of the TV ads, radio ads, billboards, whatever, magazine ads that we think of today that have pharmaceutical advertisements in them, those things didn't exist. Okay, that was a change that was made in the 90s to actually say that pharma companies could engage in that kind of advertising because they had been forbidden from doing so before. Why? Because there was a feeling back in the day that if you had that it would open the door to a lot of misleading and deceiving of consumers. Right? That if drug companies could start extolling the virtues of their various medications, that it would really warp the system and cause a lot of bad information to flow to consumers. You could really argue that that has come to pass. Okay, but why was that change made? That change was led by the industry and by their allies in the Republican Party, were the biggest reason that that happened in the first place. So now they're turning around and again, they're attacking the same policy that they used to champion 30 years ago because they've gone further and further and further to the right. And why are they doing this today? In this particular instance, I think it's really interesting to think about the politics here. They, in other parts of this document, the Project 2025 document, they actually love public-private partnerships, working with industry, working with the private sector. Normally, conservatives trip over themselves trying to say everything should go back to the private sector, right? And we've seen throughout the rest of this document that they want to hack and saw away at the federal government, carve off pieces of it for themselves to be American oligarchs, what I refer to as the Kremlinization of America. They want to do for America what Putin has done for Russia. Why did they hate public-private partnerships here? Because the politics of it are favorable, they think, for them. They see more political upside to attacking big pharma, to attacking the large pharmaceutical companies, because it helps them rally the anti-vaxxers and conspiracy theorists in the QAnon base at the heart of darkness within the MAGA movement. That's what's going on here. So suddenly, public-private partnerships bad, because they think that plays better with their base. Let's just be really real about what that is. Then we really see the turn start to happen around page 455 of the document. And if you haven't actually had a chance to look at this, this is a section that you might want to take a look at. I'm reading this so that you don't have to, as I keep saying. But this is one where I actually recommend that you go and look at it yourself, because it is one of the points in the document where you just have to actually go and reread it a couple of times. It's like, did they really just say what I think they said? So it starts off with, first they want to end stem cell research, which is something they've wanted to do for a long, long time. Never mind the horrible implications that has for research into cancer or Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. If you yourself have suffered from any of those horrible, horrible diseases, or you have any family members that are suffering from those or whom you've lost to those diseases, this should be something that makes you stand up and say, I'm going to go vote. And I'm going to go also make sure that I vote all the way down the ticket. I'm going to make sure we've got the right people in Congress, because if you end stem cell research, which has been a goal of the far right for a long time now, you're going to cripple the opportunities that we have to keep on fighting these horrible diseases. And that's no joke. And that's a bipartisan issue. We keep moving here, and then we get to one of the key things in this entire document. They are going to have a pregnancy tracking database, federal, nationwide, forcing each state at the threat of having funding withheld. The federal government, by the way, just as an aside here, can effectively force a state and localities to a great degree as well, and other institutions like schools or hospitals. Any large institution in the country can really be compelled to do a whole lot of things by the federal government by the threat of having federal funding for that entity be taken away. That definitely works at the state level, because states would not be able to function without the money that they get each year from the federal government. That's basically true for most cities too. So, and it's also largely true for hospitals, because they get so much of their money from Medicare. So if the federal government says, hello, you have to do X, Y, and Z, or we're going to turn off the faucet of money to you, they're going to do it. So this is not an idle threat. When they say they're going to force each state, this is what they say in the document, to report. They want to report how every end of a pregnancy occurred in the whole country, with what stage of pregnancy it was at, how many weeks that pregnancy was at, the reason, the mother's state of residence, where any end of pregnancy occurred, the method, the exact circumstances, the complications that could have ensued afterward, everything. So they're also going to then need to know exactly when the woman's last menstrual cycle was. So let's just be clear about what the hell this is, this absolute dystopian measure. What is this for? Okay, this data collection thing that they're going to force on the entire all 50 states. Okay, this is not just going to be in the red states. People need to have a wake-up call about that. A lot of the things that they're talking about here, they are not going to be satisfied with just doing it in Alabama. They want to do it nationally. And this is one of the tells. This is one of the ways that we can tell that this is happening. Why would you need such a database like this unless you were planning on having national enforcement of abortion bans? That's why it's here. Otherwise, Alabama's already, I presume, tracking all of this stuff in some way or another to try to go get women that may or may not be having abortions, or that are having miscarriages and then need to have an abortion procedure afterward to not die in a lot of instances. And that is, in fact, the standard medical treatment in many of those situations. If you're going to be doing this kind of tracking at the federal level, it's because they're getting ready for what they plan to do, which is to pass a national abortion ban if Donald Trump gets elected and if they have enough votes in Congress. They will do it. And we saw at the debate last week between Trump and Kamala Harris, Trump dancing around and refusing to say that he would veto such a bill if it came to his desk. No, he's going to pass it. He's going to sign that damn thing. He's trying to have it both ways because he's trying to win the election. But if he wins the election, all this talk about him kicking it to the states or trying to claim like he's a moderate on abortion, bullshit. Project 2025 shows what the real blueprint is here. They're saying it. It's right here in black and white. We just need to read it. We need to listen. We need to take it seriously. They go further than that. Page 459, they're also saying that they're going to force hospitals to report any complications that occur as a result of abortion pills, which are increasingly the way that abortions occur in America. It is not by a physical procedure. It is by a pharmaceutical. They're very safe. They're very effective. This has been known for years. It's been known for decades. Okay, we're talking about mifepristone is the primary one that people know about. They want to force hospitals to report complications that they want to claim are a result of this thing. Okay. Again, they are going to be engaging in pregnancy surveillance on a national scale with a central federal database. We still can't get in this country a federal database of every firearm in this country. Okay. They will have a central database of every pregnancy that occurs to every American woman and girl. That is absolutely terrifying. And if that doesn't get you to go register to vote right now, I'm not entirely sure what will. I'm not saying that to you, of course. If you're listening to this podcast, I know you probably already registered to vote, but maybe just go check it right now and make sure that it's active and you know what your polling place is, because it might have gotten changed, all of those things. It's just a good time to remember to do that. Oh, there's more. There's a real gem here on page 465. Donald Trump and Project 2025 want to shunt seniors away from Medicare and into private insurance by making a thing called Medicare Advantage their default option for insurance. Now, what's Medicare Advantage? Hey, guess what? It's another one of these kind of public-private partnership things that they otherwise are suddenly wanting to disparage here. But it's a private insurance option that's attached to Medicare, okay? It is something that benefits private companies. That's not just Medicare, which is run by the federal government. Basically, this is a great way to say, hey, we're just going to do a little bait and switch here and say that if you as a senior do not know exactly what you're doing as you go onto the computer, which you may or may not necessarily feel super comfortable with, especially for a lot of really older folks, they suddenly might not be in Medicare anymore. They might be in Medicare Advantage, lining the pockets of certain private interests that I'm sure have donated handsomely to the Trump campaign and to various other campaigns and super PACs. Yeah, so that's fun. Then suddenly you get to page 465, and suddenly they do another somersault, and they're pro-free market again. After blasting private industry, suddenly they turn around and saying that Medicare should not be allowed to negotiate lower drug prices as part of Medicare Part D. Now, what is this about? Again, we go back to what I was saying earlier. The federal government, when the federal government wants to do something, it generally gets its way, okay, when it comes to it, because the federal government is so much larger than any of the other entities that it negotiates with, okay? When you're talking about a state or a hospital or something like that, if the federal government says X, they're going to probably have a good chance of being persuasive, if not just flat out carrying the day. This has also been true with regard to even big pharma companies. When Medicare, which is the largest insurance plan in the country, suddenly turns to a drug company and says, hey, that price looks a little high. Maybe we can do something about that. Again, this is something where the government was actually forbidden from doing this for a long time, tied up in knots by pharma. Didn't want it that way. They didn't want to have to deal with Medicare negotiating with them. They wanted to be able to tell Medicare, this is the list of prices, this is what we're charging, and have it be a one-way street. And for years and years and years, the pharma industry plus their allies in Congress, mostly in the Republican Party, some not, managed to say, nope, Medicare is not going to do this. Medicare is not actually going to negotiate. They're not going to use the power that they've got as a large player in the healthcare industry. Well, now that's changed. And we've seen the results of that. $35 a month for an inhaler, $35 a month for insulin. These are landmark deals that were struck because Medicare is using its power. And they're doing it not just to negotiate a better deal for seniors that are in Medicare, but they've gone further and said, why don't we actually make that price, that Medicare price, applicable for all Americans? And the pharma industry, to their credit, has gone along with this. There has been a meeting of the minds. There has been a real public-private partnership, if you will, to basically say, look, it's in the best interest of Americans and the pharma industry, the whole country, if we make some of these key life-saving drugs more available for everybody at a fair price that most Americans can afford. That has been a wonderful, wonderful thing. And it's been brought about because of this change in the law, where now Medicare can actually negotiate as the giant that it is, as opposed to having its hands tied behind its back by artificial regulation. Heritage Foundation people here, the Trump people, are actually claiming that they're being free market here, but they're actually not, because they're stopping Medicare as an entity from actually exercising its own market power. Pretty much everywhere I've ever seen free market economics explained intelligently, competition and negotiation are usually considered to be good things, right? Somehow here, letting a major market player negotiate and be competitive was somehow a bad thing. But let's just get out of the weeds of that for a second and recognize what they're really doing here. What are they doing to you? They're going to jack up the prices of your drugs. Donald Trump is going to jack up the prices of your medications. That is plain as day. This is just there in plain English in this document. And we shouldn't be mistaking it for anything else. If Donald Trump gets back in, drug prices are going back up. So there you have it. We didn't even get through we got through about half of the HHS section. Like I said, this was one of the most shocking and terrifying things. And I'm not easily shocked by these far-right people. But this was beyond what I even considered they'd be willing to espouse. I guess I'm actually less shocked that they believe these things and more shocked that they were crazy enough to put them in print, right? They actually took a lot of their sort of evil plans and they actually just put them all in a document. That's one of the amazing things about this document. And then, of course, they're like, we didn't do that. Trump didn't have anything to do with that. They're scrambling because we actually have been shining a light on this. And I want everybody to continue shining a light on this. We're going to have a lot more of these episodes to come. In the meantime, make sure to follow me on Twitter. Subscribe for free to my Substack, where I've been writing about these issues as well as part of Decoding Project 2025. Make sure to follow this podcast so that you always get new episodes automatically downloaded to your devices, and we'll see you next time.